Let's just see if today could be a bit cheerier than yesterday. This is Wretched Radio, bringing you church news. Gotta be better than yesterday or worse. No promises. It actually might be worse because it's the church and not the world. This is Wretched Radio. Yesterday, a bit gloomy. The world seems to be changing very rapidly in unprecedented ways. I don't think we're progressing. I think we are regressing. Let's take a look and see how the church is doing today, shall we? It looks like Andy Stanley is doubling down. You may recall a number of months ago he said that we need to unhitch the Old Testament from Christianity. Then, in an interview, he said the Ten Commandments, absolutely, I repeat, absolutely, he said. Do you hear me?
Absolutely.
The Ten Commandments do not apply to Christians. Well, now he's brought it back into the fold, into the conversation on the internet, doubling down, writing an article for Relevant magazine. That's telling,
that
isn't
bastion
it?
Of great thought and diligence.
Relevant I could be wrong about this, but I think they asked me to once write an article for them. This was a number of years ago. I can't recall. But they allowed me to just say whatever I wanted to. As a rule, this is the home of liberals. Progress. This is the home of emergents who couldn't land any play. This is their little outlet, now that Brian McLaren and Phyllis Tickle aren't as popular as they once were. Headline, why do Christians want to post the Ten Commandments and not the Sermon on the Mount? Well, I mean, just one practical reason might be just the number of words you can chisel onto a piece of stone. Just saying, it might be that. Furthermore, the Ten Commandments are a pithy summary of God's laws. Not all of them, certainly, but probably pretty much everything could fit underneath those categories. Furthermore, Andy failing to understand the Sermon on the Mount was actually not a lovey-dovey bookmarker. Blessed are those who are peacemakers. And then they apply that to police officers, for whom I'm very grateful. But that Bible verse has nothing to do with the police force in America in the 21st century. The Sermon on the Mount was a magnification of the law. You got to be like this. You're going to be blessed only if you're like this. That is taking the law and going, just like when Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, you've heard it said of old, thou shalt not commit adultery. I say you look at a woman with lust, you've committed adultery in your heart. Furthermore, Andy, 9 of the 10 commandments are reiterated in the New Testament, which it seems that is his desire. We're just New Testament. We have nothing to do with the Old Testament. I got to tell you something. I don't think that we can conclude that Jesus was definitively the Messiah. You could argue from the resurrection standpoint, but without the Old Testament, he was nothing but an open-air preacher claiming to be God. And there have been many of those. And they usually get put in a padded cell. But Jesus, because of the history of the Old Testament, because of the history of a nation, because of the history of a religious system, he was credible. I'm it. You know those genealogies that you followed from Adam to Abraham? We visit Boaz in the middle, then we get to David. What is that genealogy doing in the Old Testament? Well, we see it in Matthew chapter 1. We see it right away in the Gospel of Luke, the genealogy of Jesus Christ. It's his genealogy. That's the genealogy of the Messiah. That's who we've been tracking in the Old Testament. More definitive proof that Jesus Christ is he. Why is there that one genealogy in the Old Testament? Why? Well, the answer is because it's the Messiah's genealogy. And we see that in the New Testament, but we don't appreciate that in the Old Testament. Furthermore, you want to appreciate the New Testament, start reading of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Why would I care? And who is Adam anyway? You don't get to hear about the fall. You don't get to hear about the flood. You don't get to hear about Joseph. You don't get to hear about Abraham. You don't get to hear about all of the bad kings, the few good kings, the faithfulness of God to his covenant promise to Abraham, his high and holy standard and how he deals with his enemies. All of that gone. And we just read the nice New Testament. I got to tell you, the book of Revelation makes Ezekiel or any threatenings in the Old Testament from God, quite honestly, they pale in comparison. It was typically in the Old Testament warnings to Jews, behave, this is a part of the Mosaic covenant, behave and I will bless you, behave and I will take care of you because I want to bless you so that the other nations can see how you behave and get saved. Hold on one second. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to find this, but I'm going to give it a go. Last night was reading 1 Samuel. I believe it was chapter 8. 1 Samuel chapter 8, the history of Israel. A lot of details inside of there that you maybe would say, well, what's the point of all of this? 1st, 2nd Samuel, no, it's 1 Kings. Sorry. I made it through 1st and 2nd Samuel. You want a great read? Go read 1st and 2nd Samuel. It is gripping. It's better than anything you're going to find on a rack at the grocery store selling whatever it is that they sell there for literature. All right, let me see if I can find this in 1 Kings 8 because it repeated over and over again. First of all, it talked about repentance. I want you to return. I want you to stop sinning and return to me. That's repentance, not just a mere mental assent. So the queen of Sheba comes for a little visit. It must be chapter 11 where it's at because it's verse 35. I seem to remember that. Here we go. Verse 35. Oh, please let this be right. But I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand and give it to you, 10 tribes, and to his son I will give 1 tribe, that my servant David may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen for myself. I'll take you, I'll reign over your heart desires, and you shall be king over Israel. Then it shall be, if you heed all that I command you, walk in my ways, do what is right, keep my statutes and commandments, as my servant David did, then I will be with you and build for you an enduring house as I built for David, and will give Israel to you. And then he goes on to talk about, so that the nations will see you and flock to Jerusalem. Israel was God's evangelism program. Behave, I'll bless you. The other nations will get wind of what is going on here and say, that must be the home of the true and living God. Let's go. That was why they were given all of these laws. All of that lost courtesy of Andy Stanley. We don't get to learn any of that. Was God not nice in the Old Testament? He's perpetually nice. He's preaching through creation. He preaches through conscience. He preaches through an innate knowledge that God actually exists. And he preaches through the nation of Israel, who are still amazing that they are standing today. Andy Stanley now goes on to argue, if we're going to create a monument to stand as a testament to our faith, shouldn't it at least be a monument or something that actually applies to us? Like the Old Testament doesn't. And I have to confess, he's a nice fellow, but his presentation bordered on downright incoherent. I'm sorry, it just did. The justification, here's one example. The justifications, this is just think logic, reason, and argumentation. The justifications Christians have used since the 4th century, writes Andy, to mistreat people find their roots in old covenant practices and values. Really? Imagine trying to leverage the Sermon on the Mount to start an inquisition, launch a crusade, or incite a pogrom against Jews, but reach back into the old covenant and there's plenty to work with. Not good history either. The Nazis used the Jews, labeling them Christ killers, to exterminate them. Andy, that's from the New Testament, not just the Old. Furthermore, just because atrocities were committed by some people who likely were not regenerated anyway, and they use the Old Testament. What does that have to do with unhitching it? Abusing something doesn't mean relegating it to the ash heap. He concludes the article by saying, you weren't included in the Old Covenant to begin with. Oh. It has nothing to do with you. Well, except that the Old Covenant was the promise of a Messiah. So why are we fighting to build monuments to it? You can determine whether or not you want to build a monument to the Ten Commandments. That's up to each individual. But that's not the problem. That's not the core of the issue. Andy Stanley does not seem to have even the most rudimentary understanding of the flow and the arc of the Bible. To quote one Phil Johnson, unhitched from the Old Testament? No. Unhitched from Andy. This is Wretched Radio.